So it's a great pleasure today to introduce one of our early career distinguished visitors, Dr. Patrick Gray from Durham University, lecturing in Durham on Shakespeare and Renaissance literature. He's co-editor of a book with John D. Cox, Shakespeare and Renaissance Ethics, and guest editor of a forthcoming special issue of Critical Survey on Shakespeare and War. He's got essays published in all the best places, including Shakespeare Yarbook and Shakespeare Survey. And at the moment he's working on a monograph on shame and guilt in Shakespeare. And today he's going to talk to us from his early chapter on that book as a genuine work in progress. So welcome, Patrick Gray.
So this is my efforts to lay out the conceptual framework for reimagining the concepts of shame culture and guilt culture, and how they might be useful for students of the medieval and early modern period, and perhaps for other periods as well. Okay, so I'm going to start with classics and then move into early modern history. So the concept itself of a distinction between shame culture and guilt culture emerges in the sort of mid-early 20th century with a book by Ruth Benedict called The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, which was published just after World War II, when Americans were occupying Japan. It was an effort to try to understand this mysterious sort of former enemy. Benedict concludes that whereas Americans as well as Europeans are driven by fear of guilt, the Japanese are driven by a desire to avoid shame. Now, the book was a popular sensation, became a seminal academic influence, and remains a topic of controversy for anthropologists. Today, it also has gone on to spark an ongoing discussion within the study of ancient Greece, which has recently spilled over into some books about ancient Rome as well. So I wanted to ask, how might this be useful for the study of Shakespeare and for the study of medieval and early modern Europe more generally? So I'll start with, in his book-length study, Ewan Fernie, who I understand has been here as well, in his book Shame and Shakespeare, says that the distinction between shame culture and guilt culture is still very much in use, but increasingly rejected as both inaccurate and oversimple. I think this assessment is both correct and incorrect. There is a desire to revise this distinction, or to modify it somehow. People feel like there is something awry about it as it has been used in the past. But I don't think that's the same as a desire to sort of scrap it altogether. There's a sense that there's something useful in it if we could figure out how to think about it. And I think one index of this sort of persistent canonicity is the reappearance of the concept of shame culture and guilt culture, of this distinction, in the Sather lectures at Berkeley. For classicists, this is basically one of the premier venues for speaking to non-specialists. And so I'm going to look at three of these in particular: E.R. Dodds in 1949, Hugh Lloyd-Jones in 1969, and then Bernard Williams in 1989. And each of them come back to this concept of shame culture and guilt culture. And both very, very preeminent classicists in their own right. So this all starts with E.R. Dodds, 1949. He's basically explicitly taking Benedict, and behind Benedict, Freud, and applying their categories to the differences between Homeric, archaic, and classical Greek society. And then 20 years later, Hugh Lloyd-Jones is going to defend, again, this sort of broad strokes distinction between shame culture and guilt culture, although he emphasizes that they're relative terms, that no society is entirely one or the other. Instead, they're a sort of way of thinking about propensities or inclinations within cultures. So now 40 years after Dodds, this is in 1989, in the lectures that become Shame and Necessity, Bernard Williams just states flat out, "It is accepted that the world of Homer embodied a shame culture, and that shame was later replaced in its crucial ethical role by guilt." Williams, however, is going to strongly object to the idea that this distinction is grounded in the relative degree of internalization of moral norms, as per Freud or Benedict. He says, "Both shame and guilt possess an internalized component, and neither is differentiated from the other by the fact that it may occur before a real audience, before a fantasy audience, or before oneself." He says, and he gives a thought experiment. He says, "Suppose someone invites us to believe that the Homeric Achilles, if he were assured he could get away with it, might have crept out at night and helped himself to the treasure he had refused when it was offered by the embassy, then he has sadly misunderstood Achilles' character. And I think that's a very revealing thought experiment. And here I think we might see a contrast with a book, What is Honor, recently by Alexander Sandy Welsh, where he's going to argue that we can be this kind of observer to ourselves and that shame can occur in relation to our own judgment, independent of others. Williams is very skeptical of this kind of autonomy. He writes, the idea that the other in ethical thought is nothing at all except an echo chamber for my own voice, that is, that we are our own self-sufficient judges, he argues in a sort of Hegelian way, overlooks much of the substance of actual ethical life, specifically our social embeddedness. We draw our standards from those around us, and this internalized other is abstracted and generalized and idealized, but it's somebody rather than nobody. It has a specificity, a granularity that comes from our social context. And this idea of a generalized or internalized other or internal audience is one of the sort of most basic premises of most post-Freudian psychoanalysis, object relations theory. It's one of the sort of points of distinction between what might be called classical psychoanalysis and present-day relational psychoanalysis. So Williams is going to try to dig into the etymology of shame, or in Greek, eidos, which he connects with nakedness. He compares it to German, where shame is like die Scham, the genitals, and also in Greek, eidoia, or shame, is like eidos, the genitals. So he's trying to say that the basic experience of shame is related to being seen naked, or being seen, he thinks more generally, in a kind of wrong or disadvantaged condition. And this doesn't necessarily have to be sexual or literal. So for example, he cites the example of Lear on the heath. Lear's nakedness is more than just sort of sartorial. And Lear sees it that way. He talks about unaccommodated man, a bare forked animal. We're really just what poor Tom is. So Williams is going to say the idea of the connection between nakedness and shame is that shame is related to a loss of power, a sense of being at a disadvantage. So I would say shame is a reaction to an abruptly introduced consciousness of oneself as powerless. And this tends to be provoked by being seen as such by someone else. You realize that you lack power because someone else sees you that way, as unprotected or vulnerable. So again, Ewan Fernie in Shame and Shakespeare is going to say the concept of a distinction between shame culture and guilt culture might be salvaged if we could redefine these concepts. And I think Williams points the way towards this revision. I think what everyone has always rejected from the beginning, even Dodds and Benedict, is the idea that these are absolute categories, like, I guess, Foucault's episteme or Kuhn's paradigms. The distinction is only relative. So I'm presenting them here as, I guess you could say, kind of caricatures almost, or hypothetical constructs like geometric figures, which in actual practice will be complicated, will overlay each other, but enable a kind of clarity of thought and analysis. Okay, I think what Fernie is right about is that Benedict's initial articulation of this distinction has come under pressure and indeed basically been rejected. And this idea that shame cultures rely, this is coming from Freud, that shame cultures rely on external sanctions for behavior, whereas guilt cultures rely on an internalized conviction of sin. Benedict is also getting this from Margaret Mead, but anyway, all right. I don't have time today to talk about developments in psychoanalysis. I'm happy to answer questions about it, but one of the major developments in psychoanalysis over the last 30 or 40 years is new attention to shame and to narcissism and to disorders of relationality, which Freud really doesn't talk about very much. So people sense this gap in Freud's system and dive into it. And I'd be happy to talk about how the notions of shame that emerge from that fit the revised definition of shame culture that I'm trying to put forward or propose. Okay, so coming back to Benedict's sense of it, shame cultures rely on external sanctions such as violence or ridicule to enforce morality. Guilt cultures rely on internal censure of the conscience or the superego. So this is coming from Freud's sort of speculative proto-anthropological treatise, Civilization and Its Discontents, which had been published in English about a decade before Benedict's book. In this treatise, Freud, where Freud originally says everything is libido, in this later pessimistic period, he's going to posit a death drive alongside the sex drive, which just as love sort of pulls, this is modeled on Empedocles, but that's another story. Anyway, just as love pulls human beings together into families and communities, the death drive drives them apart into contentious, self-destructive, atomistic aggression and violence. He writes, the inclination to aggression is an original self-subsisting instinctual disposition in man and constitutes the greatest impediment to civilization. And he's responding here to Rousseau. He's responding to Marx, disagreeing with them. But anyway, all right. So as he sees it, civilization is a compromise between the sex drive and the death drive. In order to inhibit our aggression and permit a more communal existence, we progressively introject our aggression and turn it against ourselves in the form of conscience or superego. So you could say that the price that we pay for civilization is a loss of our happiness through a heightening of the sense of what he calls guilt, this aggression against ourselves. But he's going to have a strange definition of it. He launches into this elaborate, almost like an alternative book of Genesis, accounting for guilt. Guilt he sees as the most important problem of civilization. But his use of this term, Schuld, is counterintuitive. So the way we normally use guilt, we mean something like remorse. Most people, if you say, what's the difference between guilt and remorse? They would say, well, remorse is like very, very extreme guilt. But Freud is going to draw a sharp distinction between these two. And he's going to say, what most people mean by guilt is wrong. They mean remorse, Reue. So then when we think, well, what does guilt mean? And he goes on for a couple pages. It's never really resolved. His language becomes very tortured. So he says, nor will it do any harm if we once more review the contradictions which have for a while perplexed us and so on. All right. So then he turns to his clinical experience. He really wants to say guilt is something other than remorse, but he kind of forces it. Turns to clinical experience. He says, well, everybody knows what remorse is. That makes itself perceptible to consciousness. But, he complains, our patients do not believe us when we attribute an unconscious sense of guilt to them. They merely feel a sort of malaise, a dissatisfaction. And this is the discontents of civilization and its discontents. So Freud, though he's undaunted by this sort of lack of evidence, he's basically insisting throughout that guilt, what we call guilt, is, as he says, at bottom, nothing else but a variety of anxiety. Specifically, it is a fear of the loss of love. So in other words, guilt, which Freud defines as synonymous with angst, is his term for our pervasive fear that if we do something wrong, we might be abandoned by other people, we might be ostracized. So it's, if we act upon our natural instinct for aggressiveness, then we'll lose the benefits of our shared civilization. So this is his sort of idiosyncratic redefinition of guilt. And he says, okay, so at first, we're afraid of the tribal chief or the father, and then we set up a superego that sort of repeats this within our own mind. And this is guilt, fear of this superego. Now he's going to acknowledge that this kind of two-step notion of civilization, first shame culture, then guilt culture, is reductive. He writes, we have sharply delimited events which in reality occur by gradual transitions. It is not merely a question of the existence of a superego, but of its relative strength and sphere of influence. So, if you're familiar with the work of Norbert Elias, I think Norbert Elias essentially takes this sentence as his starting point. He says, okay, I'm gonna spell out incrementally what Freud just sort of gestures toward in Civilization and its Discontents. And this is his monumental work, The Civilizing Process, which, if you're not familiar with, is a sort of what he calls a history of manners in Germany and France, just after the late Middle Ages going into the early modern period. So he's going to say, much in keeping with Freud in a more detailed way, that initially in the period he studies, society is kept in order by each individual's fear of punishment, including not just violence, but also scorn or humiliation or ridicule. And then in later stages, this fear of punishment becomes an internal anxiety, what Freud would call a sense of guilt or angst. All right, so I'll come back to Elias in a bit, but that's where we're going with this. All right, so one of the things I think we find in classics is that this Freudian framework begins to dissipate rather rapidly. already in Benedict, even, she's not using guilt the way Freud does. It doesn't. Freud for guilt for Benedict is synonymous with remorse. It doesn't arise from repressed impulses. It's not a species of anxiety. Instead, guilt is just remorse. It's what when in response to a definite sort of misdeed or abuse of power, and it can be relieved by confession or atonement. It's not a form of fear. Guilt for her is something to be feared. It is the pain of having sort of misused your power. So although in a sense Freudian, she's reverted to the sort of normal understanding of what guilt means, which I think is useful. So I think a way of reimagining what she's saying is that a member of a shame culture organizes his life to avoid shame. Shame is the worst thing. It's the summum malum, you could say. And then a member of a guilt culture has the reverse. They organize their life to avoid guilt. And these two priorities are not always compatible. And that's where things get interesting. That's where we get things like Macbeth, torn between pity like a naked newborn babe and vaulting ambition, which o'erleaps itself and falls on the other. So we have these Shakespearean characters torn between these. But any society will sort of tip over time towards one or the other pattern, giving rise to what Benedict calls patterns of culture. So she was particularly interested in recounting World War II, how American soldiers were horrified that the Japanese didn't have rescue teams for the weak and wounded. They saw them with disdain. They were horrified that when Japanese soldiers would seem to surrender, but then at the last minute turn and try to kill at least one or two other people because they felt honor bound not to give in. So her book is an attempt to make sense of these cultural differences. She's applying it to a geographic difference, or we could say a synchronic difference. Dodds is going to take it back and make it a diachronic difference within Greece. And for him, Homeric Greece is what Japan is for Benedict, as the earliest sort of period available. And he's going to say, Homeric man's highest good is not the enjoyment of a quiet conscience, but the enjoyment of time, or public esteem. Dodds is closer to Freud. Dodds is going to say guilt means anxiety. He's going to say authors of the classical age, such as Sophocles, reveal an increasing sense of anxiety or dread, a pervasive fearfulness, which has its origin not only in the extreme personal insecurity of the archaic age, but also the primal fear of the father, which in ancient Greece, as in ancient Rome, had tremendous practical power over the family, as in the Roman concept of the sort of pater familias. Anxiety about possible patriarchal aggression appears to the Greek consciousness as fear of the gods. The gods are, for Dodds, a projection or pictorial expression of Freud's superego. Dodds, again, the first of these Sappho lectures, doesn't actually, however, spend much time talking about Homeric culture. It's just a sort of foil. To illustrate his point quickly, he talks about Homeric heroes' fear of being mocked. And this is something Benedict picks up on as well, the Japanese imperative to clear the name. She writes, when the Japanese believe themselves humiliated, revenge is a virtue. And Benedict very astutely says, well, this is not entirely foreign. We may reject this now as a result of modern liberalism or Christian moral theory, but it's analogous to older periods, she says, of Western society. So she writes, it flourished mightily in the Renaissance, especially in Italy. Something very like it underlay dueling in Europe, even as recently as 100 years ago. All right. So Dodds has a student, W.H. Adkins, is going to dive into Homeric culture and really start to flesh that out. And Dodds is going to see two rival systems, ethical systems, which he calls cooperative and competitive, in keeping with Margaret Mead, cooperation and competition among primitive people. He's going to say, within the cooperative paradigm, goodness is justice and self-control. So dikaios une, sophros une. Within the competitive paradigm, goodness is arete, is virtue, is something more complicated. He has a definition. All of these words in his definition are linked by hyphens as a single word in the Germanic style. Strength and bravery and wealth leading to or preserving success. That's a bit unwieldy. But I think another way to think of it is that what he calls competitive ethos is a precursor to what Machiavelli calls virtù. You know, the prince's power, the prince's capacity to preserve power by any means necessary. Adkins here is indebted to another classicist, M.I. Finley. who is notable for two reasons. One is an explicit indebtedness to Nietzsche, which was very rare at the time, I think partly due to Nietzsche's association with Nazism and whatnot. You don't see that same kind of explicit indebtedness until we get to Bernard Williams. Hugh Lloyd-Jones kind of dances around it. In his study of Homeric society, Finley presents what people who study the history of England might recognize as a kind of crisis of the aristocracy. And he says, modeled on Nietzsche's account of the slave revolt in morals. So this is Finley now. When the community began to move from the wings to the center of the Greek stage, the hero quickly died out, for the honor of the hero was purely individual. Family attachment was permissible because one's kin were indistinguishable from oneself. The honor of a community was a totally different quality, requiring another order of skills and virtues. In fact, the community could only grow by taming the hero and blunting the free exercise of his prowess. And a domesticated hero was a contradiction in terms. I think this problem of the domestication of the hero is actually what I'm going to talk about at the Emotions and Ethics sort of symposium we're having. We can see it in people like Hotspur or Coriolanus in Shakespeare. So look at surveying all of sort of Greek development, Adkins sees a gradual and finally incomplete paradigm shift. Both value systems, cooperative and competitive, are always in play, always making a claim upon the individual psyche. In the Homeric world, the competitive is predominant. Over the next centuries, it cedes ground to the cooperative, but still remains preeminent. And then finally, in the 4th century BC in Athens, the cooperative value system really starts to come to the fore, but it's promoted by figures we love, like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. But it is not dominant within its own context. These are a minority position that ultimately loses out in Atkins' account to the sophists and to contemporary, more conservative aristocrats like Meno. Meno, what is virtue? To be good to your friends and do harm to your enemies. All right. Atkins is also going to introduce an element of sort of material social history. So Atkins is going to say, Greek history is a story of the gradual urbanization, collectivization of resources and interests, progressing from the Bronze Age, where we had these atomistic individual fiefdoms, to the growth of larger city-states like Athens and Sparta, and then finally to the establishment of the Athenian Empire ruling over much of Greece. So a transition from oikos to polis, and finally to empire, which I think we can also sort of see in Rome, and we can also see in medieval and early modern Europe. So he writes, Homeric man lived in a society of virtually autonomous small social units termed oikoi, noble households under the leadership of a local chieftain or agathos. So for this kind of agathos or nobleman, nothing is more important than the defense of this oikos by whatever means necessary. He has to protect, to provide for his own, in really a Hobbesian war of all against all, something we don't really see today except maybe on the stage of international relations. He can't scruple about things like fair play or honesty. And then in 5th or 4th century Athens, we move from the oikos to the polis, and the self-sufficiency of each nobleman becomes dangerous and destabilizing. So we get ruthless self-seeking on the part of sort of shrewd, well-spoken, deceitful politicians like Callicles, Thrasymachus, especially Alcibiades, and these jeopardize the greater good and ultimately bring it down. So you get a veneer of cooperation, but the competitive ethos is still underneath it. What's predominant? Okay, so looking at the contrast between Adkins and Dodds, we see a revision. 3 points of departure stand out, which I think are useful for us as we turn to the early modern. First, Adkins abandons Dodds' implicit Freudianism, and this whole business about anxiety and the gods and whatnot. Instead, Adkins has a theory of cooperation and competition which much more closely maps onto Nietzsche's notion of a master and slave morality. Independent, aristocratic warriors who are forthright, quick to resort to violence, fiercely proud of their self-sufficiency, give way over time to urbane, eloquent, duplicitous politicians who, although equally selfish and ambitious, at least pretend to be concerned about the common good. This is what Elias is going to talk about as well in his idea of the transition from the warrior to the courtier. Second, Adkins is going to say that ideology is not the only explanation for the change he describes. It's this new ethos of cooperation is also a result of urbanization. And finally, he's going to say this moral revolution is not entirely successful. People like Socrates, for instance, is going to proclaim himself a citizen of the world. He's a model for cosmopolitanism, but he's not the majority. Athens as a city-state, as an empire, is going to exercise that empire over other polis without such sort of enlightened sympathies. And finally, people like Alcibiades are going to bring it to ruin with the Sicilian expedition. Okay, so for students of early modern history, there's a number of parallels here. One, this idea of sort of independent noblemen abandoning their warlike ways for civility. This is a lot like what Elias' civilizing process. So he talks about how the rise, you have the rise of courtoisie, of impulse control, sensitivity to others as necessary for success under increasingly absolutist monarchs. Atkins is going to give a similar account of changes in the manners of the Athenian upper class. And this also resembles what the English historian Lawrence Stone is going to call the crisis of the aristocracy in early modern England. As in ancient Athens, noblemen in Tudor England are going to become more tame and tractable under the necessity of flattering a newly powerful sovereign. Only in Athens, the sovereign is the demos, is the people. In England, the sovereign is the monarch. And then finally, Atkins' emphasis on urbanization and collectivization of interests alongside intellectual history suggests a supplement or parallel or perhaps alternative to Nietzsche's emphasis on religion and the emphasis of Christianity as the key factor in the shift from shame culture to guilt culture. So Elias, very influenced by Marxism, is going to insist that religion is always an effect rather than a cause. He's going to say religion never has, this is him, never has in itself a civilizing effect. It is always exactly as civilized as the society that produces it. Religion for Elias is an epiphenomenon. Stone, in contrast, is going to grant some influence to the rise of English Calvinism into what he sees as a sort of renewed, intensity in the pursuit of Christianity. I am going to say, as a way of trying to reconcile these things, that I think Christianity, in conjunction with other developments such as advances in military technology, the pervasiveness of Christian ethics, spurred on by the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, is at least in part why the transition from competitive to cooperative ethics that did not really finally take hold in ancient Greece did manage to stick in the early modern period and go on very slowly and imperfectly to become the cosmopolitan, relatively compassionate, after a process of secularization, to become the Western culture that still dominates today. We're not as sort of totally homogenous guilt culture in any sense, but there is a difference there, and I think that alongside these other processes, the emergence of Christianity contributed to that kind of tipping over into a different ethical sensibility. Okay. All right, so I'm going to quickly just give you some sort of quick highlights from Stone and Elias for those of you who might not be familiar with this. Stone basically emphasizes that England under the Tudors was surprisingly lawless, especially outside London. Rival lords would stockpile weapons, keep retinues of armed retainers. So he points out, as late as the 1570s, the Earl of Oxford was accompanied not only by gentlemen, but also by 100 yeomen in livery. So this puts a different spin on Lear's request for 100 knights. Lear is not necessarily being completely mad or unreasonable. He just represents a sort of older model of what it is to be a king, one that was on the wane, but would certainly have been recognizable to many people in the audience as what it meant to be a nobleman. Stone also points out that in the feuds between these houses, all sorts of things were fair play. Surprise ambushes, attacks from the rear, onslaughts by overwhelming numbers. This was not necessarily a discredit. But then he's going to say, by the end of Elizabeth's reign, the English monarchy has required a much more substantial monopoly of force, and the English nobility sort of lose their taste for warfare. They're discouraged from keeping armed guards. The weaponry sort of starts to fall into ruin. They start to channel their energies into things like litigation. So we get this explosion of lawsuits, one lord against the other. And Stone sees in this also a transition in sort of English sensibility. So he talks about in his own time sort of English stiff upper lip quasi-stoicism. He says, well, that wasn't always there. If we go back earlier periods, you have short tempers, impulsiveness, as a badge of pride, of aristocratic fearlessness and independence. And he actually says, the behavior of the propertied classes was characterized by the ferocity, childishness, and lack of self-control of the Homeric age. And that comment got me thinking, there's a parallel between these two historical trajectories. And he's going to see a demise of the old school no-holds-barred violence. So surprise ambushes, blows from behind, were no longer seen as honorable. There's a very interesting book by Anthony Appio where he talks called The Honor Code, where he talks about these changes in notions of what it is to be honorable, looking among other things at dueling. We also have a sort of change in allegiance, broadly speaking, from the personal lord to the nation state, exacerbated by the wars of religion. England as a Protestant, who are you? Well, instead of being, a Yorkshireman, I'm an Englishman. This is a sort of change in notions of the self, which we could also see parallels on the continent in Spain and whatnot. All right, so Stone is focused on the consolidation of power under the Tudors. Elias is looking at a much broader picture. He's looking at arguably parallel developments, like the rise of the Medici in Florence, French kings, like Francis I and Henry IV. Elias is not interested in any particular prince, but instead what he sees as an inevitable process of what he calls it a strict regularity that is encountered wherever social processes are observed. Remember, he's a Marxist. He wants to see sort of impersonal laws and forces. And he's going to see what he calls a monopoly mechanism. Eventually, as a market tends to gravitate towards monopolies, so also force tends to gravitate towards those who have it. And then this affects our psychology, and man becomes civilized. Elias is going to take pains to say this is still ongoing. We're not completely civilized, and perhaps we could never be. He says maybe a few hundred years from now, our ancestors will be just as horrified by us as by our predecessors, or not our ancestors, but you know what I mean. But he sees a before and after. The before is the castle on the autarkic, self-sufficient estate, and the after is a bunch of courtiers gathered, around the one monarch. Now, I think his description of this picture of the before of the agrarian warrior society very closely resembles Adkins' conception of the Homeric society. And it's this world of sort of small, self-sufficient, isolated estates plagued by bandits and nomads and whatnot. And Elias says, in this circumstance, as he puts it, a strong moderation of drives is neither necessary, possible, nor useful. Survival itself demands readiness to fight, free play of emotions in defense of one's life and possessions. He says, when a monopoly of force is formed, pacified social spaces are created which are normally free from acts of violence. Monetized trade basically renders communities interdependent. Sudden explosive violence and outbursts of emotion become disruptive rather than self-protective. Conflict becomes sort of risky for this interdependent system. And so this enforces, as he says, a constraint on the affects, a self-discipline and self-control. And then he's going to have the idea that, like Freud, that this civilization comes with discontents. This is not entirely natural to the human being. The nobleman has to give up his former spontaneity. He says his extraordinary freedom in living out his feelings and passions and savage joys. And this can produce, as he says, tensions and disturbances, dissatisfied daydreaming, constant feelings of boredom or solitude. Drive energies are dammed up in a form that permits no real satisfaction. This is Freud's sort of malaise, akin to what Nietzsche is talking about when he talks about pity producing decadence. And to me, has an interesting parallel to Shakespeare's Hamlet, as the guy who can't work up the gall to revenge his father, even as he feels like he ought to. So I will quickly, I'm gonna race to the end to say, I think that we can see something similar in Shakespeare's depiction of the ancient Romans, and especially the turn towards Stoicism as a way of dealing with defeat in the realm of honor. So characters like Brutus or Coriolanus turn to Stoicism because they feel that they can't, they feel out of place in the new emerging political order. And the authors like Gordon Braden or Wayne Rebhorn are going to explicitly link this to Lawrence Stone's notion of the crisis of the aristocracy, that Shakespeare, in depicting these Romans' turn to Stoicism, is commenting on his own aristocracy. And it is concurrent chronologically with the emergence of Neo-Stoicism, and may perhaps help to explain the attractions of Neo-Stoicism in this period. Okay. All right. So I'd be happy to talk a lot more about the Roman plays if you want to ask. But I suppose the point I would want to get at is that the terms shame culture and guilt culture have drifted well away at this point from their origins in Freudian psychoanalysis. They've been pressed into service, at least in the world of classics, as you could say euphemisms in a way for what Nietzsche calls master and slave morality. And I think, basically Bernard Williams is going to kind of let it out of the bag and say, listen, when we're talking about shame culture and guilt culture, we as classicists might as well admit what we're doing. We're using them as a stalking horse to draw upon Nietzsche's genealogy of morals. We don't need to feel embarrassed about that anymore, the way that we did several decades ago in the wake of World War II. And I think that this development in classics may be useful for us in the medieval and early modern period as well. It allows us, for instance, to see, I would say, that Nietzsche and Shakespeare are both interested in the same kind of slow-burning historical transition in assumptions about ethics. This change, I would call it the change from a shame culture to a guilt culture. Nietzsche, of course, would call it much more provocatively the slave revolt in morals. I think Shakespeare is interested in tracking this transition across his Roman plays, across his English history plays. I also think Shakespeare, although he sees the same chessboard as Nietzsche, the same kind of process, his sympathies are on the other side. So what Nietzsche thinks is good, Shakespeare thinks is bad, and vice versa. Shakespeare, I think, is on the side of pity as opposed to honor at the end of the day. Okay, and more generally, looking beyond Shakespeare, I think it would be interesting to try to draw parallels between changes away from Homeric society into classical society in Greece, changes within Rome from republic to empire, changes within England over the course of the rise of the Tudors. I'm inclined to agree with Stone that what we see with Elizabeth I's reign is the emergence of a kind of fledgling guilt culture, and to ask how much is this due to material socioeconomic factors, how much is this due to religious ideological factors? Is that distinction artificial or helpful? And then in my own case, try to dial down and see how does this play out across Shakespeare's plays. Okay, that's all.